Hello and welcome to the very first national discussion. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We will be looking at three key policy areas this evening ahead of next week's Senedd election. I'm Jess Davis. I am a presenter, vlogger, social media person, and I'm coming at this discussion with quite a basic knowledge of Welsh politics, which I think might reflect a lot of the country. But luckily for us, joining me this evening is the National's chief political commentator, Theo Davies-Lewis. Hello, Theo.
Hi, Jess. Good to be with you. Obviously, as you all will realise, I've brought the brains and the looks to this conversation. So it's fantastic to be here, and this is obviously a really crucial election. And I'm the chief political commentator for the National. What that means in reality is that I write for politics, and hopefully this is meant to be a discussion. It's not me to give you all my thoughts or Jess's thoughts, because I do that every week anyway, and you're all fed up with it. So it's a really important election. I think, I recognise some of the names in the group, and I don't have to explain to all of you, what the Senedd does, but, the Welsh Government has powers now that it didn't have when devolution first started. It's gone from an assembly with little legislative powers to a parliament, which does have lawmaking powers, and that has obviously been in focus over the last 12 months. And if you look towards Thursday's election and what the results will mean for the next 5 years in Wales, I think it's going to be the most consequential period, because we've got the bigger constitutional question obviously being asked now, probably on the periphery in the campaign, if I can offend some people in the chat already. But I think we're at a crucial time now in Wales, and we hear so much about building back better on a wider scale. And just because we're a country of 3 million people doesn't mean that we don't have to do that either. We need to make sure that the Welsh economy, the health service, our education system is fit for purpose in 2021 and beyond. So it's not a politician's zone today. Obviously, that debate is happening in about an hour and a half, I think. So we'll make sure you can get off for that. But we want to hear your views and help answer, any questions you have. So, I think now we want to make sure that we don't have any vote for me slogans during this discussion. We want to put some questions in the chat. Obviously, I think Jess will do some of the more insightful talking this evening as somebody looking towards Welsh politics. But I think the first issue that we're going to look at is one of the most, I won't say controversial, but one of the most debated along with the others in this election, and that is education.
Absolutely. And education, of course, we've all been to school. Some people watching might still be in school. Some people might have recently left and be looking at further education. So it's definitely something that affects everyone at some point in Wales. So Wales seems to be quite behind, or seen as being behind, to other UK countries when it comes to education. But why is that, Theo?
I don't know, Jess. I mean, it's very hard. It's very hard. I mean, the first thing to say, I suppose, when you look at education as an issue in Wales, from my point of view, and please do challenge that question in the chat as well, because I know some of you will say, oh, well, where's that basis of that question come from? Do put those in there, and it'd be interesting to see what you think. But what people look at in Wales, I think, at the minute is things like the PISA tests, and that is how lots of rankings are judged. And some people argue that's not the best criteria to do. So some people look at where kids go to university, whether they're going to the top universities. Then there's other means of debating it. If you look at some of the main policy pledges from education, let me just run through some of them, because I think they are quite interesting. So look at Welsh Labour to begin with. They've got that new curriculum for Wales starting I think next year, and that's focused on sort of higher standards of literacy and numeracy. They also want to make sure that you can protect the education maintenance allowance, support for families as well. That covers different costs and all these policies. I don't want to give them all to you, but they're on the BBC Wales website. There's been policy analysis in the National, but there's clearly big issues that each party wants to focus on. The Conservatives are being more critical, I think, of where education is in Wales. They want to scrap the Welsh back. I never did the Welsh back, actually, Jess. I don't know if you did.
I did do the Welsh back, and my little brother is 15 nearly now. He hates the Welsh back. He thinks it's a waste of time. Personally, I'm 28, so say roughly 10 years ago I left it, and I loved it because it was an easy A. I mean, it helped me go to university because it was kind of like, there's your A, you know, and it went towards my UCAS points. So I'm quite, I wonder why children now, why is it criticized so much? What don't they like about it? Do they just think it's boring? Is that it? Or does it not have the same effect anymore?
I think it's, I mean, and it'd be interesting to see if anyone's actually done the Welsh back in this call. But I think the issue is, if I was to bring myself back to my teenage years, is that I think it doesn't qualify as an A level for certain universities, and also people think it's a waste of time in the sense that it's not the equivalent then of an A level or something. So that's what, and now the Welsh Conservatives are very much tapping into that, and I think that's one of the big issues that I think a lot of young people in Wales are trying to address at the minute with education. Is what are they getting out of it throughout COVID? I mean, I think the aspiration of young people at the minute, I speak to a lot of them because I run separately to ranting about Welsh politics. I run a graduate network to attract people to come back to work in Wales. And I think most young people obviously are very ambitious, very attached to Wales as well, and want the Welsh economy to do well, but perhaps don't get all the skills from education that they could have had in some way. So, I mean, it's a really, really strange one. And I think for me, the Welsh back is probably one of those election issues with young people who then when they'll say, oh, these politicians don't stand for me or they don't speak for me. But actually, if you hate the Welsh back so much, vote Welsh Conservative, basically. That's what some people might interpret it as. So, I mean, it's a really, really tricky one. And I don't know about you, Jess, but looking at some of the policies now, for example, the Welsh Lib Dems also have a policy to implement the new curriculum, which obviously is quite a radical one, because included in that new curriculum will be new teaching sort of parameters for things like learning about Black, Asian, ethnic minority communities, and the study of that in the Welsh curriculum for all children. Not for the sake of it, but because it's important. I mean, I just thought I'd ask you, because you're obviously somebody now that's gone on to do so many different things. But did you feel like when you were growing up in Wales, I didn't, by the way, that you had a kind of complete Welsh history, or like a grasp of Welsh history, and that includes, the sort of the diversity elements that are probably coming into it a bit more now, but more generally as well?
Gosh, no, absolutely not. So I grew up and went to school in Aberystwyth, and I didn't know anything about Welsh history. I went to an English speaking school. I learned Welsh, fluent Welsh now, but I really didn't know much about anything. And I think it's such a shame, that you're taught about the Tudors and Spanish Armada, and that's about it as far as it went for me personally. And then I didn't even know about stuff like MySP that existed as Senedd, because it wasn't kind of taught to me. I wasn't told about it. I wasn't exposed to it. So I feel like definitely there should be room for just more education when it comes to Welsh history, and that's as a whole, diversity, but also the Welsh history in terms of like Tryweryn, things like that. It was just not taught to me, and I've had to now go out of my way to learn it. But I think a lot of people wouldn't go out the way to learn it because they might not know why it's so important. So I think that's definitely something that should be looked at, being implemented and put in subjects.
Fortunately already that we've been told, well, I've been told I'm wrong already in the chat, so some ways. No, they're very insightful comments from some people in the society of Welsh civic life that we've had. So Ben has put in a small challenge to that question. That is that Cymru has some of the highest levels of literacy across all ages in the UK, in part because of our bilingualism, and that's right, obviously, which is a fantastic thing. And I think this is why, obviously, and I've been guilty of it as well in my columns, for full disclosure, that I say, I remember writing, I think in the Times about, specifically about Welsh conservatism, and how it'd be very easy to talk about a failing health system, a failing economy, and a failing education system. But those are good slogans that lots of politicians put out. But in reality, as Ben touches upon, actually there's so many set criteria that you could judge all these different policy areas on. But I think that's, again, goes back to my point about PISA system and like GCSE attainment grades and that sort of thing. That's what, and I actually think that's what a lot of families might be looking at as well, to be honest with you. So, it's it's a really, really strange one, but I take Ben's point totally. And Hugh, if you can put some of the policies up, save me sort of scrolling through them all on my laptop, pretending that I know them all off by hand, which would be really useful. But other than that, then Richard's got a comment. Richard Martin, obviously, well-known podcaster and scriptwriter in Wales. So even though I say those kind words, he still put a very difficult comment in there for us to tackle, which actually looks at how you can't discount the challenge for the Welsh back in trying to be established in Wales as a modern European-style qualification, when the majority of population/parents don't have a great knowledge of devolution era Welsh education, but have values instilled in pre-devolution period about qualifications, A-levels, GCSEs, O-levels even. We're not like Scotland with a long-standing unique education system. Again, this is perhaps the point really that we're in, is that I'll tell you all a secret. So my parents, they tell me anyway, I don't know whether it's out of spite or just to annoy me, but they voted against devolution in 1997, and they're very pro-devolution now, obviously, which has been instilled in me. But I think Richard touched the point there that, you know, lots of people of my parents' generation, in their 40s and 50s and whatever, and older, perhaps don't have a sense, it's from a parent's perspective, perhaps, of the value of the Welsh back, and that might be translated into younger generations as well. I mean, like I said, I can't speak from experience because I never did the Welsh back. Personally, very anecdotally, again, which is very selfish, I certainly had the same sort of response to to the Welsh back, that perhaps it wasn't getting much use for them, but that's again very anecdotal and probably more of a reflection of the sort of people I was hanging around with rather than the value of it. But Richard raises a good point there, and how actually I'd say the curriculum for 2022 is probably the most radical shift in education that we've had in Wales, and that was welcomed by Kirsty Williams and the Welsh Government after the working group in terms of what specifically Charlotte Williams is doing, but then the broader curriculum itself, which is certainly very interesting. Let me just touch upon, Jess, just a few of the other policies on here, because Plaid Cymru are talking about free school meals for all children. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about world-class early years education and childcare, because it's, these are very, very complex things that I am not even skilled on myself. But I just want to, lots of these sort of policies of education are very much tied into things like the economy and finance. It's not necessarily get kids to get better grades. They're basically connected. I just wonder, whether because you speak to a lot of young people, probably more than me. My demographic's probably a few decades older. All right, because you look at young people you speak to, for example, who are in school. Do they have a sense that their learning, for example, goes beyond the classroom, that it's the stuff like, a lot of people from poor backgrounds in some cases, the child poverty rates in Wales, for example, are quite high. What is your sense of, how that plays into it, and sort of the financial elements of education, and how we can get kids to have free school meals? So the Marcus Rashford campaign, an influencer like yourself, obviously. I mean, what does that say to you, perhaps, about how that will play in over the next few weeks and after the election as well?
Well, I think the Marcus Rashford campaign just showed how much of an impact school has on children, not just on education, but, further afield, and just looking out for them and caring for them. I think it's 1 in 3 children in Wales live in poverty. So that is just such a huge number that we need to be looking at. And that kind of, not that it links to Welsh back, but when we're going into how the Welsh back might help, it's not all about UCAS points, because I remember when I did Welsh back, it's stuff like looking at how to, run a business, how to hold a little shop, how to do your taxes, and that is what the kind of conversations around young people is. Oh, I wished in school I was taught how to do my taxes, or how to invoice, and how to, do my bills, and then I go to uni. So actually, it isn't necessarily giving you that impact in terms of here's your UCAS points, here's your A level, but the Welsh back did teach stuff around business and key skills. So again, that is obviously something that needs to be taught to children and young adults, is key skills. And it's a conversation that comes up a lot, people my age, but also people younger, saying, I wish I was taught everyday things in school, not just, how to do the Pythagoras I can't even went to school, Pythagoras, read them Pythagoras thing in maths that obviously I did not know how to do. So yeah, I think definitely it does feed into that. And I think we need to look at it as further afield of just the classroom and actually how it affects children's lives. Because think of how often you spend in school. Do you know what I mean? These teachers are having a huge effect on children as well.
And what I was going to ask you actually, because you mentioned them just about those sort of skills. Generally, this is a more of a personal question about, going. I don't know, did you go to university or not?
Yeah, I did. So I went to university it was University of Glamorgan when I was there, but now it's South Wales.
Oh, really? I was just going to say you're a bit older than me now, but that's fine. I mean, I look about 10 years older than you, but it's fine. But I know my question was more about so obviously now you've obviously got sort of a television career and doing so many different campaigning work and whatever. And obviously not everyone is going to do that in their life. It's a very sort of unique and great sort of contribution you're making. But is uni then, worth the expense, or has been worth the expense? I mean, it was for me because I went to a fantastic university and I had so many opportunities from it. I had a lot of support in education anyway. But do you think you get a lot out of university when you were there? And do you think people think the same as they did maybe 10 years ago about going to university as they did before?
Well, this is the thing, it's both my age now, but when I went to uni, it was £3,200 a year if you went to uni in Wales. Yeah. So for me personally, it was great. I did sociology at uni. I studied sociology, which is not the sector that I'm in at the moment. It definitely helped me have a wider view of the world. So I guess it helped in that way, but I don't have a job in sociology. I know a lot of my friends did similar kind of stuff like religion. Another of my friends did sociology. None of us work in them sectors. So it was more of a life skill and we just wanted to kind of get out and enjoy uni. But actually, when you look at it for the degree, and that, now with tuition fees that are, £9,000 a year, and even looking at COVID, how that's affected university teaching at home for £9,000 a year, is it worth it? I don't know. But what do you think, Theo, in terms of opportunities for young children, young adults, if they're leaving school at 16 or 18, is there enough apprenticeships out there, work experience out there, jobs out there for people to decide actually not to go to uni? What's that looking like?
Yeah, I mean, it's a strange one because there is an emphasis now as well with making sure that education, if you look at the policies, and I'm afraid that I could go through, however many parties are standing, there's probably more than 10 to be honest with you across Wales, but there's different parties, and I know that again, for example, the Conservatives want to really emphasize apprenticeships, and I think that probably goes back to the whole Conservative model of they're obviously really, really hammering the economic message as they always do in this election, unless obviously talk about hospitals, they don't know what they're paying for and how many there's going to be, but generally they're talking about the economy. And they're very big on apprenticeships. You look at the other parties, they all realize that it's not necessarily about going to university, getting a humanities degree like me, and then just writing columns or whatever. You need to get skilled people in there. I mean, I think one of the good policies from the likes of the Lib Dems, for example, they're very big on ending digital exclusion, and I think that's a really, really fantastic thing that we need to be investing in devices and digital skills. I mean, there's been a lot throughout the pandemic about access to laptops and stuff like that, and I think these are really, really unsexy discussions that I'm having here, but they're really, really crucial. And this is what I think people don't realize, is that obviously they'll have this debate later on. It's all very much it'll be about Tory sleaze, and that guy from Abolish will turn up and whatever, and then Mark Drakeford will sit there very presidential, but all these parties minus a few do really have these policies that consider with much nuance what an education system in the 2020s should look like. And it's not just get a degree and go to a job. It needs to be far more nuanced than that, which is something that we should obviously welcome, because otherwise we're going to be living we're not going to be building back better at all, which is obviously the fundamentals of the election, I think, to be honest with you. And that probably leads on to the second topic. And if you, keep putting the comments in. We're going to talk about the economy now. And is the economy exciting, Jess? I don't know. Is it?
It's not that exciting, but it's what makes the government and the world go round, right? The economy. So yeah, we definitely all need to be thinking of that when we're ticking our boxes. But what does the Welsh economy look like at the moment? What kind of state are we in?
Well, I mean, it's not the best state simply because we had a pandemic, obviously. And I think, Mark Drakeford actually in particular talks about people out of work and those sorts of figures, because I think, now, again, like education, you could point to so many statistics about, GDP, for example, that compare that to the rest of the UK. And Wales then, as has been seen in many debates, mostly around independence, interestingly, and we'll probably get onto that, that essentially independence is the argument people mean, Wales is too poor to be independent. So this is not a discussion of independence yet. But that, to take my point, that basically Wales' economy at the minute is in a bit of a state, but it's faring okay. The furlough scheme from the UK government has supported so many businesses. I think in my conversation I had on my separate podcast with Professor Dylan Jones-Evans, for example, self-employed people, freelancers, have been left out in the cold a lot, and I know the opposition parties have really hammered that in this election. So the economy is sort of trudging along. If you saw the analysis from the Wales government centred on the specific economic policies from the different parties, I think the Welsh Labour Manifesto was deemed, I wouldn't say least radical, but wasn't the most radical out of the three. And that's probably the most sensible thing. You've got, Plaid Cymru for, talking about young people, Plaid Cymru guaranteed job, or I think it's real living wage for 16 to 24-year-olds. You got Welsh Conservatives, 65,000 jobs. I mean, it sounds absolutely amazing, but it doesn't really. There's lots of questions about the financing of this.
Well, that's the thing, yeah. Where are they coming from? This is it. This is where I get a bit confused when it comes to party politics and the election times. There's a lot of promises, but where are they coming from? Where do these jobs come from? Where do these apprenticeships come from?
Well, it's a very good question. I think a lot of people are thinking about it, and now, actually, ironically, we've had a Conservative government in the UK government that has been happy to spend during the pandemic, which you wouldn't think Conservative economics works out like that. And I think, obviously, that if you look at how the Welsh Conservatives, as an example, because they're very, very strong, want to be strong in the economy, they're very much sort of cutting. I think they've got a tax for small business, cutting tax for small businesses, scrapping business rates for small businesses. They want to bring together different elements of the Development Bank of Wales and sort of amalgamate, basically recreate a WDA kind of feel, Welsh Development Agency kind of feel to Wales about inward investment. There's lots of controversy about that. Plaid Cymru have a kind of radical agenda, which has been costed by two economists. They kind of, if you read the analysis of it, actually they say that it's obviously, most of it's quite sound. There's a few bits which aren't so sound, but they're not definitive about it. And that is something that is something you should look out for in his manifesto. But I think if I'm to be very biased, as I always am when I speak, I think by saying that the Welsh Labour Manifesto is the maybe not the most radical, it probably tells you something about the economics of it and how it's been worked out. And I think they played that very safe. They could have gone out with a huge spending pledge, they could have raised taxes with certain limitations of what they can actually do. But for example, they are being more cautious about it, Jess. I mean, the question I had for you about the specific policies, and actually be really, really useful to have comments in from the chat about how you're feeling about the economic picture. You're a small business owner, whatever. I mean, if you're a small business owner, you're an entrepreneur, you're finding your first job, whatever it is, it's good to get your thoughts about what are the main economic priorities at the minute. But I was just wondering, Jess, I touched upon education there, and I'm sorry I'm going on for so long, but touched upon education there and finding a job and stuff. Obviously, you've got this fantastic career, but is it very hard now, I suppose, for young people to find those jobs in this job market now? It's going to be very tough, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And especially that loads of people are out of jobs. So, there's such small pickings for jobs available. Personally, I'm self-employed, freelance, and it's just, never ending searching for your next job. And I feel like a lot of young people are choosing to go self-employed and set up their own business or be freelance. And that's what I'm a bit concerned about in terms of where is that funding coming from? Where is that support coming from? Especially when on a different scale, when I go back home to Aberystwyth, which is where I was raised, you walk down the high street and it's empty and everything's closed. And you think, you know, all these jobs that are going to be apparently created for people in Wales, where are they going to be happening? Where are they going to be popping up? Are they going to be funding money in the places that need it, these smaller towns, rather than the cities that are getting the money? Because these small towns are kind of dying out. And it's really sad to see, you know, when they're kind of what holds Wales together, I think. So, you know, is there any sense of where this funding is going to be going or where these jobs are going to be created?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good point. And I think, again, you've got this focus now is particularly on different parts of Wales as well, because I think we're in danger sometimes of focusing too much on Cardiff and southeast Wales. You know, I'm from Llanelli, and you know, I think now there's lots of young people in my area that have moved away. I mean, I'm in London and I come back when I can to Wales, but that's a decision I have to make, very anecdotal again. But it is something that, you know, you're right to raise. You know, you've got, for example, different ways of finding employment, and they do have to be usually. I mean, if you're inclined like me in this moment, you've got to have government support in the economy. You can't just let, you know, private sector innovation happen by itself, and you've got these such dire consequences. So, you know, again, if you look at the young person's pledges, you know, Labour, 125,000 new apprenticeships, again, back to the apprenticeship point. You then also have got things from the Lib Dems, who also want to expand, I think, degree apprenticeships at postgraduate level as well, which is kind of going back to our point about education, the value of education. I think it's very, very enlightening to see that you've got policies now from parties that are sort of thinking of it as a hybrid way, not necessarily go to university, go get a job. That's just not the way the economy, mixed economy, the hybrid economy that we have now. And, you know, again, back to your point about how do you sort of catalyze or spark economic innovation, I think the problem we've always had in Wales, speaking as a very naive 23-year-old, is that we keep harking back to the WDA a lot. And we have to realize, and again, you can all tell me I'm wrong in the chat, but obviously the Welsh WDA was fantastic for just getting jobs, but they were just any jobs really, and it was obviously different issues within WDA itself. But interestingly, the Tories and Plaid, I mentioned the Tories earlier about what they wanted to do in terms of bringing together Development Bank of Wales and other organisations to bring out the best aspects of WDA. You know, Plaid Cymru want to create a new development agency. I think it's called sort of Prosperity Wales or something, Prosperity Cymru, whatever it is. And that is focused on SMEs and entrepreneurship. And I think that's one of the key things that we have to realize. You know, I run a startup, like I said, and I think the SME economy is a vibrant one in Wales. You wouldn't think that if you were reading economic analysis like we talked about. It's obviously a very difficult situation, but these SMEs need support to scale up. Government needs to play its part in doing that. You know, are free ports, for example, another way of stimulating economic growth? I'm not necessarily sure, but it is clear that, you know, alongside making sure that you've got business relief schemes for different businesses that have been badly hit throughout the pandemic, you also need to make sure you've got the ideas to back it up, because without doing that, you are going to struggle within Wales to actually make an impact and cut through. Because I think the economy right now, and if you disagree with me, you can tell me, Jess, but I think it's the most crucial issue now because people are thinking about it. We've had a couple of comments on UBI, which I think is very interesting in itself, universal basic income, of course. And Ben has pointed out again that UK government control the central bank and are opposed to it. So again, another important point about what powers the Welsh government have, and people get confused by this quite often, especially young people, because they're not told about it. I mean, I spoke to a school this week and went through all the different policy areas. Obviously, I even had to, you know, make sure I knew what I was talking about and go online and find out, you know, because it isn't necessarily clear. I think UBI, a universal basic income, is a really, really innovative idea. I think it will take probably a left of centre government, if I can be so controversial, to introduce something like that rather than a conservative government, which is a shame. But I think that is I'd like to see cross-party cooperation on it, but that might not necessarily be the case. But before we move on, Jess, I just wanted to ask you again, just on the economy specifically, because it is a really, really, important issue for all of us, throughout this whole election at the minute. Do you think at the minute that, if you look aside from all what we're talking about now, do you think that there are job opportunities in places like Aberystwyth, where you're from originally? Do we have that balance now? Because we talk a lot about brain drain. Do we have a diverse enough economy for people to stay in Wales and help build Wales as well, or not?
No, I mean, personally, I think no. A lot of people I know from back home in Aberystwyth move out as soon as they can. A lot of it to the cities, to Cardiff or beyond, to London, to Bristol, because that is just where there's more job opportunities, especially when it comes to creative. I think, especially in small towns, there's very like council jobs, teaching job, and that's the kind of level which are great, but it's just not enough, and it's not enough to entice people, I think, to stay in their small towns and then feed into their economy in the small towns, which is why they're dying out. So I don't know what the answer is, but I feel like there's something that's got to happen to encourage people to stay in different areas of Wales, because it's great. And I'm live in Cardiff now, and that's where I went to uni and that's where I work now, and there's plenty of opportunities in the creative world in Cardiff at the moment. But if I left Cardiff and even started moving back up Swansea, Llanelli way, like there isn't that many. So I'm kind of stuck here. And I feel like that's the way for a lot of people. And a lot of young people are doing more creative work now. They are setting up their own businesses. They're going freelance. They want the freedom to move around and work from home and all of that. Can you do that in small towns? I don't know. I don't think so, which is a shame, because we don't just want to be pumping money into the big cities. It needs to be going to the smaller towns as well, because that's how we, build a whole Wales and a Wales that's great for everyone.
All right. I completely agree. I mean, I don't like these panels where everyone agrees with each other, but I think we do agree quite often, Jess, which is helpful. But on the environment, then, it's our last, well, sort of semi-last topic before we finish up at 8. And this is probably, I think, the biggest emergency that we're living in. I remember I was doing an interview with historian Martin Johns, and it was all about the union, actually. But at the end, he went on a rant about the climate emergency. And I kind of thought, that's not the topics. That's not the topic we're focusing on. But then I just thought, yeah, actually, he's got a point. And it was quite prophetic, actually. And this is the last issue that we're focusing on for editorial reasons from here, which told us to focus on 3 issues. I could have done about 10, but we're doing 3. So on the environment, Jess, it's probably the most important topic. Do young people have different attitudes to elderly people, if I can be so rude, on the environment?
I think it's a difficult one, because you are seeing huge movements. Greta Thunberg is obviously the icon of young people when it comes to climate change and global warming. And I think it has spurred a lot of young people to feel like, yeah, this is something we need to tackle. I definitely think Gen Z as we call them, are more interested in social changes, in climate change. But then, you see the kind of middle ground, and I always think, great, things changing, we've got hope. And then you see like the scenes down Cardiff Bay a few weeks ago, and all that litter left out is the same in Singleton Park in Swansea. There's one in Llanelli, Ogmore Beach. And it makes you think, okay, maybe young people don't care as much about climate change as we're led to believe in these protests online. Is it just a kind of shtick that we like going to protest and skipping school and being part of something, or are we actually wanting to make a change? And like I mentioned, I live in Cardiff. You walk around everywhere, it's just litter. You go from junction 33 into Cardiff, and it is about 12 minutes straight of litter on the road. It's disgusting. I go back to Aberystwyth. My dad goes litter picking at the side of the road at his spare time. It is everywhere. I've driven through Cadair Idris, people are litter picking. It's everywhere. And what can we do to get a lid on it? I don't know, because like I said, there's many protests around it, but are people actually bothering to do much on their own behalf? I'm not sure.
Well, so do you recycle then, Jess? You told lecturing everyone. Do you recycle?
I do recycle, but that's about as much as I do. I don't have a straw when I go on a night out. I have a little paper one now, McDonald's, but
that's just saving the planet in your own little way.
In my own little way, but I'm not a vegan or anything like that, so I'm obviously not doing enough.
I think that's fine, Jess. I mean, if you look at I think you're right, and I think it's an individual responsibility as well as a collective government one. I mean, let me just go through some of the policies, and lots of knowledgeable people on this call, so I'm not going to lecture you all. But here, if you want to put them up, I'll go through some of them now because I think that these are some of the most important. I've so far omitted the Green Party from this, as well as a few others. I have to apologise to everyone watching back of this. Not deliberate. It's all Hugh's fault, not mine. But I think I must give attention to the Green Party simply because I think they have been leading the debate on this for years, and now everyone's talking about a climate emergency. So the Green Party, interestingly, wanted to have a Welsh Government Commissioner for Biodiversity and Animal Protection, for example, to reverse the decline of biodiversity in Wales. They also want a bill, I think, on single-use plastic, which is really, really progressive. They want a green vision for net zero by 2030. That obviously varies between whatever date you fancy, 2030, 2035, 2050, it could be anything. And this is what a lot of the parties talk about, the climate emergency. So the Conservatives have a Clean Air Act to cut pollution. They also want to ban single-use plastics for non-medical use, so like things like wet wipes and that sort of thing. They also want to meet net zero carbon emissions targets by 2050, which is another interesting one. So there's the different dates, who is more radical, what is most deliverable, and that's a question in itself. I like the Labour Manifesto pledge about a national forest for Wales, which I think is a really nice policy, actually, if they can do it. And I think that obviously goes hand in hand with creating biodiversity, then also abolishing, in a good way, to abolish the use of the most littered single-use plastics, and they also want to create jobs, green jobs, and that's something I think we need to remember. With all of these policies, is that it goes hand in hand with the economic side. You want a green recovery. I mean, it's got to actually mean something. So I always look back to things like the tidal lagoon in Swansea, and that again, a great example of UK government perhaps not supporting those ventures in Wales. But then, look, just before I ask you a question, Jess, you've got things like Lib Dem pledges on investing $1 billion per year to fight the climate emergency, creating green jobs. I mean, it'd be great to get more specific detail on some of these, but this is basically the headlines from this. Plaid Cymru have a Wales-wide mission to generate 100% of electricity and reach zero emissions by 2035. So another different year. They want a Nature Act as well. So they want a Nature Act with, I think it's targets to restore biodiversity by 2050, which would be very interesting. What I like about the Plaid Cymru Manifesto in particular on this is that they want to have good quality sort of green spaces as well within all sort of households, which I think is fantastic. And unfortunately, I grew up in a florist, so I had about an acre in the middle of Senedd where there was lovely lawns and everything. So I have my own microclimate in Senedd, which is lovely. And I always felt that when I go back now, going back next week for the election, I always felt amazingly lucky to have just a bit of green space where it was in the middle of Senedd, which was lovely. So those are some of the policies. Jess, you've obviously given me an overview of where people are at already with the environment, but with all these things about Green New Deals and stuff, do you believe that, or does it work? Does the economic sustainability and environmental sustainability work hand in hand for you?
I just think it all sounds great, but is it feasible? Is it just words? And I think because it's never been done before, we don't know if it's going to work or not, and we don't know if it's just words. So I think a lot of young people probably feel the same, and not even just about environment, but just in general. And I think that might be where the disconnect comes when it comes to politicians, especially kind of the older politicians, old politics, and then young people. It's like it all seems to be a lot of words and a lot of promises, and then nothing actually comes off. And I know obviously they can't get all their promises through, but I think that's where the kind of I don't want to say disrespect, but distrust around politics comes from in young people. So yeah, the new Green Deals sound great, and it does sound great, but how are you going to put a field next to Port Talbot, in the middle of Port Talbot, that's 5-minute walk away, or all these places? How is that feasible? I don't know. Is it just a dream, a pipe dream?
Well, Jessica Crowley has a good point here on a separate matter with the environment, which is that we should have a green sovereign wealth fund with the profits from clean energy put into it. Wales has an abundance of clean energy sources we could invest in. I think this is interesting, isn't it? Because we hear so much about our resources. I mean, I always think, when I think of Welsh resources, very depressingly, I think of Tryweryn. And I think of all these things about going back and how we hear of, particularly from Plaid Cymru, sort of the extractive economy that we've had and all these resources, and we haven't made enough of them. I mean, Jess, do you get that sense as well, that perhaps we don't make enough of the resources that we already have, and we need to do that above all else when it comes to things like the environment, which can benefit us economically as well?
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to ask about that because I guess it feeds into the economy as well, and especially the conversation around independence, which I won't go too far into because I go on and on. But, if we're going to help the environment, we've got a lot of renewable energy that we could use in Wales, we could invest in, which then that's the kind of argument around Indie Wales, is that's where we get our money from, and that can help build our economy. So it seems to be this circle. So is that what parties are looking at? Is that on their tongue or no?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting that you just ask me that now, because Richard's put in the chat that I think in response to Jessica's point that you need to think about reform/devolution of the Crown Estate to put that into action, which is, again, another good point about what we are in charge of. I mean, you mentioned, and that's a good point to the independence matter, because the answer to all of our problems is Welsh independence. If you listen to the likes of Adam Price and other pro-independence parties, and that might be the case. I mean, I saw a video before I came on today from Mark Reckless, who has shapeshifted very much politically over the years, who was asked whether he thought the Welsh were inherently fit to sort of govern or whatever Andy from Channel 4 asked. He didn't really answer the question. So I think it comes back to this idea now, what would independence do for Wales? I mean, I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle with most Welsh people, because I'm very much pro-devolution. I think most people actually would buy the Mark Drakeford kind of view, that let's have a radical federal system, which, by the way, we can't do without UK government support. And then if something happens to Scotland, then we need to reassess. I think that's where most people are actually in Wales. So I think back to your sort of point, Jess, I think does Indie Wales have a solution to some of these problems? I mean, what do you think? I don't know whether have you publicly revealed your support for independence before? I don't want to out your Indiness or non-Indiness on this call if you don't want to, but I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, no. I was a guest on the You Yes Yet podcast, which discusses Indie Wales a couple of weeks ago, and I'm very much probably similar to you. I like the idea of it, but I just don't know how viable it is in terms of the economy. And I think that's a lot of people's questions. So if that would solve our problems, then that would be great, And I do want to see a future Wales where we have more control, because I think a lot of these questions that have been coming up, it's kind of like, oh, we don't have the power to do that. So I think it would be great, but I definitely would like to see more in terms of if it's affordable. But I guess that brings us to the kind of last segment of the chat, Theo, which is, what does the potential next 5 years look like with the new government?
Well, if you read my columns, okay, guys, read my columns every week, and every week within a few days are completely out of date. Because of the opinion polls, but. I can give you my prediction. There was I think there was a Santi Comres poll today about the Welsh election. I think it had Labour on 27, the Conservatives on, Plaid Cymru, I think, on about 15, Tories on 13, and Abolish on 4, Lib Dems on 1, I think. Good, well remembered. And I think that's probably a fair reflection of where we are. I think you've got obviously a different range of all the polls. You could probably see Labour drop from 29 to 22 if you really wanted to be disastrous with that outlier in the polls we saw last week. I think essentially we're going to see Labour as the largest party, and I think that will mean either they get into coalition with the Lib Dems if they got 29 to make sort of a working majority with 30, or if they're sort of around the 25 mark, that they have a coalition with Plaid Cymru. I don't really see a confidence and supply deal working in this next parliament, simply because I think there's so many policy areas just so at a critical stage, and devolution is at a point now where we're at a crossroads, really. So now and I think he was put in some of the, I think this is that might be the constituency list there that he's put in. And then I obviously was talking about the seat projections, but basically I think you'll have a Labour led government, probably with Plaid Cymru. I'd like to see that actually, because I think that's probably where most people in Wales are at, and certainly where most people at Plaid Cymru are at as well, because Plaid Cymru members love the idea of a Labour coalition. And this is the important point, obviously, about a coalition, that I think what you will have is similar to the one Wales government in 2007, when I was a mere 10-year-old or 9-year-old, believe it or not. And you will see then a kind of nation building exercise, very radical economic policies, left of centre, probably with Adam Price as Deputy First Minister and as Economic Minister as well, driving a kind of centre-left agenda with concessions on Welsh nationhood. But I think those will come naturally, and I think eventually, if depending on events in Scotland, you will see you'll see a shift happening in the Welsh government in stance on the union. But I think that will come naturally, simply because Mark Drake has been prepared to do it already. He's not going to be prepared to be bullied by Adam Price on the independence question, and he's already said he's not going to have a referendum unless Plaid Cymru win a majority, which is, I'm very happy to say I will eat this. I'll eat this mug if Plaid Cymru win a majority in the state. I'm just, not going to happen. But I think, back to your question, Jess, next Welsh government, Plaid and Labour, I think is very possible, would be very exciting. If you've got any predictions, put them in the chat before we finish, because they'll genuinely be interesting, and maybe give us a sentence why you think that, or if you think I'm completely wrong. Jess, let me be really rude and ask you who you're going to be voting for.
Well, this is the thing, you see, I've kind of flitted between Labour and Plaid. I vote Labour for my MP, and I've been looking online, and there's this whole, well, you're never going to get in this idea, well, they're never going to get in, so don't vote for them. There's tactics around it, isn't it? And I guess if you're a young person and you're 16, you're coming to this straight away, can you say that your vote's really going to count? Do you try vote tactically, or do you just wing it? This is it. You want to make a change? Because I feel like we are at that kind of moment now in Wales where there is this conversation. People are sick of the same old. They want a change, especially young people. Should young people kind of vote tactically, or just go for it? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we're having some fantastic messages here. Ben's telling us to use your regional vote, to vote with your heart. I mean, it's a great message, a very good message, a very politician message, which we said we wouldn't have on this call, actually, so that's not allowed, first of all, but no, it's a very important message. And Jessica Crowley, interestingly, Labour Plaid, hopefully a first Green MS, possibly, again, you're right, and this is obviously the point you think of, I think it's 40 constituency MSs, 20 regionals, and I was saying this I didn't know whether I was patronising at all, when I was explaining to some sixth formers I spoke to today of the electoral system in Wales, and it's not very simple to get your head around. It's not the most effective. I mean, Westminster's not the most effective either. I think electoral reform. I think there's a piece today in Nation.Cymru about the need for electoral reform to be on the table if there is a coalition, which is very interesting. So I think you need to vote tactically wherever you are. I think, like in Llanelli, I would. So I live in London. I don't think I get a vote anymore, depending whether I still get one, because whether the family seat in Senedd gives me a vote, I don't know. But I would certainly be using my vote wisely in Senedd, for example, as to who I would want to win. Because I think the majority of the current Gwlad candidate in Senedd is the last vote share, the last votes that the Gwlad candidate this time had was bigger than the majority of Labour in Senedd. So that obviously tells you a lot about the possible splits within different constituency seats and how you can vote tactically. As you can see from the polling today, compared to 2016, Labour is still very comfortable, though. Conservatives had a boost, but that actually, again, inadvertently, would not deliver the Conservatives more seats than Plaid in this recent poll, which shows you the sort of madness of our electoral system. I think Richard's got a very hopeful prediction, which is the lab on 29, which I think is basically ideal for Mark Drakeford. And you'll just chuck the Lib Dem in with him. I was thinking, I'm writing my column at the minute, just to self-indulge. I was writing my column this week for the National just now, and I was wondering whether even if there was, for example, Labour on about 25, 26, and Plaid Cymru in about 12 to 13, and then one Lib Dem, whether there would be like another rainbow coalition with Labour, Lib Dems, and Plaid Cymru. I don't know whether that will happen. I mean, interesting to see before we finish if anyone thinks if I'm completely going barking mad. But I think that would be very interesting. So I think Richard's probably right. Yeah, thanks, Richard. I am barking mad apparently. So listen, I think the main point to take away, Jess, on this is that it's very unpredictable. I think it's very exciting. Generally, the campaign itself, if I can give some closing thoughts on it, I think the campaign itself has been very quiet this week, which I referenced in my column for Saturday morning, which I haven't finished yet, so I better finish it over the next, otherwise the editor will tell me off. But it sort of references how it's been really quiet this week. I think there was a story about donkeys or horses going into care in Bridgend, leading one of the BBC Wales News pieces today, and the election was hardly mentioned in it. I sort of referenced that as an example of, obviously a really nice story, by the way, but it's it probably shows that we haven't really had a campaign, which is because of COVID, admittedly, that has done that. The debate tonight, yeah, fine, it'll be quite entertaining. They'll all gang up on the polish. Adam Price will have a go at the Tories. He needs to really focus tonight and getting those swing voters to him. But I think we haven't really had it. Will Tory sleaze, for example, allegations of Tory sleaze, I should say, of course, can some assume these things. Will that have an impact over the next week? I think so, because I think it'll be more about the personalities over the next week than the policies. And I think that's what it will come down to in this election. It'll be, do you want Mark Drakeford as your First Minister next year? Sorry, over the next 2.5 years. Do you want him leading you out of the pandemic? The answer is probably yes. But it could all change. And if this is resurfaced on May the 7th or afterwards, with a Conservative majority or abolish winning 15 seats, I might have to retire from my very brief career.
But that's the thing, it could all change. You look at a lot of Facebook comments and people are saying get him out, they're done, they're not happy with how COVID lockdowns have been handled. What would that look like, if we just try and put in perspective, if we have to change First Ministers mid-COVID pandemic? I mean, that would be quite catastrophic, surely, because there's a lot of switching and changing to be done.
I think it depends who's replacing him, to be honest with you. I think I have confidence in most of them. I think, over exaggeration. I have confidence in some of the leaders that are leading the main parties. I think that the likes of Adam Price is obviously a very skilled politician, and I think he's a very gifted politician, actually. And Mark Drakeford, when I was in university, the last event I did in university, when I used to interview a lot of people, was Mark Drakeford. No one knew who he was at the time. When he was about late summer of 2019, no one knew who he was. They were like, this guy looks a mess. His suit doesn't fit him. Like, who's this guy? He's First Minister of Wales. But obviously, he's really, really impressed everyone over the last year, I think. But on your point, don't believe everything you read on social media. I think you're right. There's unhappiness. The Tory message early on was cutting through quite well about lockdowns. Andrew RT was going over to the border to have a pint and all this. But I think on the whole, the odd paradox is that there's been support for the Welsh Labour government's policies, but that hasn't necessarily translated into support for for the Labour Party electorally in the polls at times. But Mark Drakeford is still the most popular leader in Wales. If we were to change First Minister, I just think it's very difficult to say. I think it would be a very difficult thing, not just actually with the pandemic, but because of where we are in Wales. We've had 22 years of Labour rule, and I think that's I know it's absolutely bonkers, but it's not a healthy thing for our democracy, I'm afraid. But as Mark Drakeford said, you've had a chance to do this for 22 years, you haven't beaten us, and he's got a point. So it would be a very transformative event if somebody other than Mark Drakeford would be First Minister. Maybe Adam Price would replace him as First Minister. If I can maybe change your question, you could, for example, not have Mark Drakeford you could have Labour Party winning, but a different First Minister, perhaps, from within the Labour Party. If, for some bizarre reason, Adam Price demanded that Drakeford would stand down in any coalition deal. And this is just, Thursday night rants here, folks. You could, next Labour leader, probably one of, Vaughan Gething, Jeremy Miles. I mean, you could take a pick. I mean, there's not many that there. So you could have someone else that could come in, but I don't see anyone other than Mark Drakeford being first minister after the election. I mean, my final question to you, Jess, just generally on this question of the First Minister, who's the politician you like the most in Wales? Like, who do you actually, like personally, like very subjective, and who do you have the most confidence in as well?
I personally have been impressed with Mark Drakeford. As a young person, I like going out and I like having fun, and I would, hope the pubs would open and all of that. But I just think that throughout, he's been very consistent throughout the pandemic and the lockdowns in terms of this is what we're doing and this is the reason why. And I do, believe, as much as I, believe in politicians at a level, that he does look out for Wales and the people, and not kind of, if I look at Westminster, for example, my personal views, they kind of more look at themselves and party, whereas I do feel like Mark Drakeford has been a good leader and wanted to help Wales and keep us safe. So that's my personal view. I think Adam Price is great. I like that he's out there. He's always on like social media. He's very out there. I actually really like Leanne Wood. She follows me on Twitter. So, but I really like her. I'd like to see more women in the Senedd. We've never had a black woman in the Senedd. I'd like to see more of that. So I would like more of a divide. But actually there is I think the Senedd, well, this goes back about 4 or 5 years, I think, when Carwyn was our First Minister. They were looking at having a feminist Welsh government and being one of the first. And that means having like a complete split. And Wales actually isn't that far. I can't remember the specifics, but I think we're kind of like there. And I think Sweden has a feminist government. They're one of the first. I'd like that discussion to be brought up a bit more. And I'd like to see women more in power, but that's my personal view. But what about you? Who do you kind of have trust in?
Oh God, I'm not allowed to say any of this because I'm meant to be unfair to all of them. I mean, listen, I think for me, I think it's pretty obvious to say that I think Mark Drakeford is a very popular leader in Wales, and I think he's got the confidence of a lot of people that I speak to. Again, I kind of try to see the value in all leaders. I mean, I think they've all got qualities that are endearing to their own base. But I think Mark Drakeford actually is because of his platform. I think to some extent, obviously they've been talking about the red walls slightly crumbling and under pressure, and it's a close election. But I do think the platform he's had over the last 12 months, obviously it's made him slightly vulnerable, but I think it's made him slightly unbeatable as well, because he is just the one that everyone knows. Adam Price has got a bit of cut through now. But the more people see Mark Drakeford, the more people like him. He's very, very popular leader. He's more popular than Boris, more popular than Nicola Sturgeon in Wales. He's the most popular leader of all the party leaders. The more you see of Mark Drakeford, you like him. And I think it's because he comes across with sincerity. And I mentioned in my column last week, I started it off with this kind of very cynical view that Jeremy Paxman used to take when he'd interview politicians, and he'd say, why is this lying bastard lying to me? And I think I'm allowed to swear on the video. I think anyway.
Warning.
You can beep it. The point is that that's what he used to ask, because he was so cynical. And I think with Mark Drakeford, you don't think that, which is very rare. And I'm not. And I'm very, very happy. I mean, I'm very critical of him in some of my articles. But I think he, like you say, is very endearing to a lot of people. And I think he's come to power, unlike other leaders throughout political history, especially those number 10. He's come to power at exactly the right time. He's an old man. He's in his late 60s. I think he's in his late 60s. He's a very elderly man, but he has come to power after years and years of experience. He's a social policy expert. This kind of pandemic was so suited to his qualities, and it wasn't suited to the Boris Johnson's qualities at all. And that people have seen that over the last 12 months. And, most leaders come to power too early or aren't in power enough. But Mark Drakeford has come to power at exactly the right time. And that, I think, will benefit him in this election, which is very, very exciting, as this discussion has reflected.
I've got one more question for you, following up on that, a bit like playing devil's advocate then. Is Mark Drakeford the most popular? Because we just don't see the rest, because the media, like we touched on earlier, there isn't a lot of media coverage around Welsh politics, so is there an unfair platform? Of course, that because he's the First Minister, so that's how we see him. He's on all the national news. But, do we need to put more Welsh politics in the media? The Wales Online need to be talking about it more, BBC News, ITV News. Like, we don't have a platform for Welsh politics. So is it quite unfair because not many people know who the other leaders are?
Well, I mean, they're gonna see them in about half an hour. But I mean, it's kind of, I take your point. But I listen. I think it's just, I said it I was talking to BBC Cymru about this on a podcast I did this week, and I said, don't have any exciting X Factor politicians in Wales, and we don't have that. And I'm totally all for saying that politicians work really hard. I totally believe they all go into the Senedd, mostly for the right reasons, I think. Not just because I disagree with some of them. I do genuinely think some of them are probably there for ulterior motives, more political motives, of course. They might think it's the right thing to do. But I think, if you look at the state now, I think we don't get enough of politics in Wales, but I think it has to come with the politicians. You need a Boris Johnson. I said this, you need a Boris Johnson in Wales, you really do. Not exactly like him, that'd be preferable. We don't want a Tonian running the Welsh government. It'd be a bit weird in today's park, wouldn't it? But I think we do need massive personalities with brains and with character and with ability. It's a lot to ask for. But you need those people in Welsh politics. We should encourage young people to do that, because otherwise we're not going to have people that stretch across the political boundaries and the political spectrum. That, I think, is the most crucial thing for Welsh public life. You want an independent Wales. I think, Adam Price is a very intellectual man, very strong, very powerful orator. But even he probably cannot cut across, probably a very depleted media landscape in Wales, a very centralised country we're living in Cardiff and in London. But I think if you had a few more electric leaders, and I'm asking for a lot here, and I'm being a typical commentator and saying it's all rubbish at the minute, I do think that would change Wales. I would just transform everything if you had one or two leaders. I think it was Rodri Morgan, and I must apologise if I'm misremembering, but I think his judge of the Welsh cabinet was always about seeing whether they were competent enough to be in the British cabinet. Because of the standards. We used to have a very strong British cabinet. I mean, I won't remember, but we used to. There used to be very, very intellectual people in there. I think, not saying that's not a judgment on the current Welsh cabinet, but I do think we need to have those high standards in public life. And I think that the media then will follow. They will pick up it. They won't be having, horses going to care on BBC Wales News. We'll have the political leader going, doing some propaganda message somewhere, which get people excited. We've seen so much about 16 and 17-year-olds, but lots of them didn't register to vote. It's a disaster, So we need that. We need that in Wales. I think it will come eventually, but maybe. Richard's saying I'm being very generous to the British government. Yeah, this is 20 years ago, Richard, I'm talking about. But I think we've got a bit of work to do in Wales generally in public life and civic life. And let me just plug the National now for very personal reasons. I think having a new national newspaper is fantastic to sort of inspire, get people reading. I mean, having people like me to have a sort of platform who have their own views, but otherwise you probably wouldn't hear it. You'd have the same voices all the time, and that isn't healthy. Like it's not having the same government for 22 years isn't healthy. So I think the most important thing of all these discussions we've had today, Jess, is to say that we're in a key turning point actually in Wales. The campaign right now wouldn't reflect that, I think, because it's been quite quiet, to be honest with you. But I think, especially if it's a hung parliament, significantly, where there needs to be a coalition, I think then you'll have massive interest in what's happening in Wales. If it's just Welsh Labour, Mark Drakeford again, yes, it'll be a stable government probably, and it'll keep going on, and he'll get in the meat. He'll still have a huge profile, but it'd be nice to mix things up, wouldn't it? I mean, make my life much easier just to write all the time about the breakup of the United Kingdom. So, but no, it's very exciting, and I think obviously from all the things we've covered today, there's individual policies there that are important, believe it or not, more than the personalities. Sometimes I still think personality is more important than policy sometimes in politics. But yeah, there's so much to look forward to. I hope, for my part, that I've given you some interesting political insights, Jess, although I probably haven't, but that's fine.
No, absolutely. It's been a really interesting, insightful conversation. I'm sure a lot of people would have enjoyed it, especially if people are watching back. Young people, I think, don't get the chance to be involved in these kind of conversations and have these conversations. And I think, like you said, it is a turning point for Wales, and especially the younger generation who are putting more interest in politics, climate change, their own education, the economy, their businesses, they're going self-employed, freelance, all of that. So it's definitely a time for young people and wider, everyone to kind of maybe, mix things up a bit, but who knows, I guess we'll see next week. And I'm sure you'll be very active online and on the National and keeping us up to date with what happens.
Yeah, please do send me your positive comments or abuse in the comment section of the National Wales's, or Twitter, even better actually, just so I see it all the time would be great. But no, thanks Jess for joining me as well. I really appreciate it. Diolch yn fawr i chi gyd hefyd. Diolch am ddod.
Diolch yn fawr, hwyl.